Welcome to this prospect webinar with Brevio on what we're calling the big pivot, the third sector post-COVID-19. It's fairly upbeat language, but it hardly needs saying that the country's in the grip of a terrible emergency. And just like the A&E doctors earlier in the year, many of the charities, the people who the community turns to in its hour of crisis, are now beginning to feel the wear and tear, maybe even to feel a crisis of their own. Resources that are there for emergencies have often been spent. Staff are tired. People who might have come in from other areas are not maybe able to skip between areas as they would otherwise have been. And in general, there's a sense that that scope, that give and take that gives elasticity to the whole sector isn't there in the way it ordinarily would be. And so a question that's always important now becomes doubly important, which is how can we make sure that the huge amount of goodwill that is out there in terms of volunteering and huge amount of money as well that's there in terms of what people are willing to donate is really stretched to do as much as it possibly can. What practically can any of us, whether we're in government, the media, or the sector itself, come up with to make it easier and to stretch every pound that's given, every hour that's given, and ensure it is used as effectively as it possibly can be? I'll introduce the speakers one at a time as we go through, because I'm keen to get straight into the discussion. But first of all, I'm going to introduce you to Billy Wright, who's speaking on behalf of Brevio, which is an organisation that thinks it's got something of an answer to the dilemma I've been talking about, or at least a big part of the dilemma I've been talking about. Billy, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm very glad you caveated that by saying it's a part of the answer, because we're certainly not suggesting we have all of the answer. So apologies from Marcel Speller, who should be here today, but unfortunately she's really feeling rather unwell. So I said I would sort of step in for her. I think it's pretty impossible for me to make up for her completely, but I'll do my best. So yes, my name is Billy Wright. I joined the Brevio board around 18 months or so ago, and I've been closely involved with the development of the Brevio platform from ideation to launch. I'm an electronic engineer by background, and through my career, I've focused on leading teams and businesses that are navigating digital disruption and transformation. I've worked across financial services, tech, media, telco, in global roles for organizations like HSBC and Samsung and Nokia, Warner Brothers, Orange, etc. But I was really drawn to working for Brevio because of really the track record of Marcel, which I think anyone who knows her will know she has an incredible track record. And I was also really keen to try and apply the knowledge that I gained in more commercial organizations to the charitable sector in hope that I could make a positive difference, and specifically to improve impact on the ground. So that's a little about me. In terms of Brevio, so what's the problem that Brevio is really trying to solve? I think it's well recognized that the current grant application and matching process is manually intensive, and it can create a significant amount of waste and overhead. And in the absence of any sort of centralizing force or government mandate, funders have understandably developed their own question sets and their own ways of working for managing the end-to-end process. And charities have had to cast their net sort of wider and wider over time in search of funds. And each of those funds has become increasingly oversubscribed. So it's estimated that on average, for every sort of 23 odd applications that charities make, so write and submit, 22 will fail. And given that most applications will be unique, that's an awful lot of waste. And it also means that funders are swamped with applications, many of which may not even meet their basic eligibility criteria. So if you sum that out, research at the University of Bath suggests that over £1 billion is wasted every year in the administration associated with the grant application and matching process. And that's really where Marcel was coming from when she set up Brevio. And that's exactly the problem that Brevio is here to try and solve. So to reduce that significant amount of administration and overhead that's associated with the grant application and matching process. So at its simplest level, you can think of Brevio as a digital marketplace that automates the initial steps of the grant application process by matching eligible charities to funders. And I emphasize initial. To Tom's point, we're not trying to solve everything. We're just trying to make sure that those upfront steps are automated in the best way that they can be. So for charities, Brevio saves a charity having to fill in multiple application forms by providing one organizational profile for the charity that captures all of the standard data that funders are looking for. It also provides space for charities to tell their own story and to write about their own mission that funders can then see. And it puts all of that in a dashboard that allows charities to manage their ongoing funding needs. And also the platform will notify charities when they've matched for new funds and maybe even funds that they weren't aware of initially. And for funders, Brevio helps your impact go further by providing a simple way to manage and streamline applications for your fund, a short list of eligible charities who can help you achieve your mission, and total control of your money and who you choose to fund with it. So to be very clear, Brevio is not involved in the decision making, it's just making the information available and making those matches. So in some ways, analogies that you could think of could be UCAS, who revolutionized the university application process by streamlining the application, offer and acceptance processes for both students and institutions, many years back. And actually another interesting analogy is the sort of current slew of digital dating apps that significantly increase the potential matches outside of, say, your immediate social circle. And Brevio is trying to do both of those things. It's about efficiency, but it's also about increasing potential matches, particularly ones that maybe you wouldn't have seen before. So it's a problem, that's the problem that Brevio set out to solve 24 months ago. What's happened since? And I think as the panel and everyone attending the webinar will know only too well, COVID has really created a perfect storm, which is really battering the sector and making solving this inefficiency problem all the more urgent. We know that the pandemic has hit the sector in many ways, including but not limited to money from public donations being significantly reduced, very high numbers of staff being sort of furloughed in both charities and funders, and an estimate of maybe up to 60,000 redundancies across the sector over the next 12 months or so. And of course, all of this is happening at a time when demand for services is actually at an all-time high. So I think we're at a real sort of tipping point in the sector, and the problem that Brevio set out to solve those 24 months ago seems to actually be all the more acute. And I think what we're trying to do is work across the sector with all parties to solve that problem together, because we can't solve it on our own. We need charities and funders to work together and support the Brevio platform or something substantially similar. And Brevio doesn't solve all of the problems, it just solves one specific one. But we're then linked into many other areas, and at the end of the day, supported by data and transparency, and that's really what the sector needs. So I'll stop at that point, Tom, and hand back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Billy. These really are in no particular order. I wonder whether it might be best now to hear from Peter Laing, who's from the Renewal Programme. We hear some truly staggering times, Peter, about the amount of time that people spend on filling in forms for funders, with estimates of how long that process takes, varying from 2 hours up to 100 hours, 175 hours, even in one reported case, which for sort of community charities is often a huge proportion of the effort that people are prepared to donate all year. What's your experience from where you sit?
Yeah, so thank you and hello everybody. So I'd start by saying that many small charities don't have sort of dedicated fundraising resources, and so we're one of those charities. So we don't have a big fundraising department. So actually, the amount of time that we spend on fundraising is already very limited. And so we kind of need to be really careful about how we spend that time. I mean, I think it's, for me, it's particularly frustrating because funders want so many different things and different funders. I mean, I've filled application forms in for amounts of, small amounts, less than £10,000, that have got reams and reams of questions, and I've filled in forms that are asking for £50,000 that have got one side of A4. So I think the lack of standardization is frustrating, and the amount of time and effort isn't really proportionate to the, to the outcome very often. I mean, I wanted to sort of paint a bit of a picture about kind of our COVID journey as well. So I'm Chief Exec of the Renewal Programme. I've been in post for 7 months, so I started a week before lockdown. So it's been an interesting ride over these last few months.
I have got in on what the Renewal Programme is, what it covers.
Yes, sure. So the Renewal Programme, it's been around, it operates in the London Borough of Newham. It's been around for just under 50 years. It's about supporting people very much at the margins of our community. So trying to find solutions for people around homelessness, refugees and migrants, carers, adults with low skill levels, and young people that are sort of disaffected and struggling. So that's the sort of the context in which we work. And it's probably worth also saying a little bit about Newham as a borough. So it's very much one of the poorest areas in the country, and really has been in the eye of the COVID storm. So we've had among the highest kind of death rates per population in the country. And that's really as a result of high levels of poverty, massive overcrowding, huge housing issues, insecure work, cash in hand work, a lot of kind of menial and frontline work. And I think there's also some cultural issues going on as well. So there's quite a lot of intergenerational living, and Newham has the highest faith contingent in London, which means there's kind of a lot of meetings in churches and gurdwaras and mosques, etc. And there's also a real sort of susceptibility with people from the BME community. Just whizzing through in terms of sort of how COVID has affected us, there's been a massive increase in local demand, particularly around food poverty, financial poverty, unemployment, digital exclusion, mental health and isolation. So when I arrived, within 2 weeks, we'd moved from having a food bank that ran once a week and served 30 people a week to running twice a week and serving more than 300 at its peak. And as an average over the last 6 months, we've had a 300% increase on our demand for our food bank services. We've fed over 2,000 people so far. Our response has been really kind of how can we innovate? How can we remain relevant? How can we? Our currency as a charity is very much around face-to-face and relationship building. But we've had to put a lot of that on hold, like many charities. So we put in place telephone support services. We have put a number of our services online digitally, and we've been forced really to make better use of digital communications, like many. We've also increased our fundraising capacity, and we've managed to secure some COVID-specific funds, which I think is sort of really positive. So, I mean, the way that it's actually impacted us is that because we have community facilities that we run, we're sort of 60k down in income from a facility hire. We're projected to be 100k down by the end of the financial year in terms of what we're expecting to come in. We furloughed a number of staff, and actually our staff and volunteer teams are quite exhausted, if the truth be told, because many of them have worked all the way through COVID. I wanted to just give you a little picture of what's going on sort of more broadly than our organisation. So there's a company called Compost London that did some research with 160 Newham charities. And 93% of Newham charities expressed concern about how they would cope financially going forward. And 1 in 4 Newham charities reported that they don't think they will survive without significant financial help. And there is there's palpable fear about a second wave of COVID. Just one more minute, and then I'll hand over to somebody else. But I think that COVID has presented opportunities and challenges for all of us. I think opportunity-wise, actually, we're seeing lots of people in our community that we don't normally see. I think people that have got no recourse to public funds, that are working sort of cash in hand jobs, wouldn't normally go near any organisation. We're seeing a lot of those people, so I think there's an opportunity to engage with them and support them. We had a food delivery to a 3-bedroom terrace house in London that had 22 people living in it. Sorry, not in London, in Newham. 22 people living in a 3-bedroom terraced house, which is appalling. But we've also seen massive collaboration. So that's collaboration, an increase in collaboration among voluntary sector organisations, but also with statutory sector organisations. And I think that's really, really important. Look, I've spoken quite a bit. I guess I'm going to end with a question. And my question really is around how, in these times of fear and confusion, how do we lead with courage and creativity in the next period of COVID?
Thank you very much. And I should say to our audience that we've now got comments starting to come through on both the Q&A and the chat thing. I'm a bit hazy on the distinction, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. There's one there for Peter about whether the data you've been talking about, Peter, is available. Perhaps you could post in a link if it readily is so. That's from Thomas Collinge. But thanks very much for that for now, Peter. Let's hear, if you like, from the other side of the table now, from Laura Chow, who is from, I bet I'm going to get this wrong, but the People's Postcode Lottery. It somehow feels like a tongue twister. But Laura, how's COVID affecting you, and how are you finding the world of form filling that Billy was talking about at the beginning?
Sure, thanks for inviting me here today. As you said, I work for the People's Postcode Lottery. You might just call it PPL for the rest of this time. So in my role of head of charities, I've really seen the impact that the pandemic has had on communities across Britain and overseas. You won't be surprised to hear we had a huge surge in applications from local communities. And actually in our last round of community funding, we released an additional 4 million to support good causes, but we received over 51 million in terms of applications coming in. So there is also this challenge of just not having enough money to give to the need that we're seeing out there. It's not, and all of those applications, a huge number are eligible, majority are eligible, really high scoring. We just don't have the funding to put into that. So that's one additional challenge. We also saw a rise in requests from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, and we're actually allocating 20% of our funding specifically to support those groups. But again, there are many more than that allocation that are eligible and great projects to fund. We tried to work with existing charities and said that they could change the purpose of existing awards. They could extend the timing of their reporting. We also included co-funding as something for all of the small charities, which we hadn't really done historically, but we gave them that option. And really, the adaptation, the innovation, the collaboration, the sharing has been really inspiring and humbling through the time. Our charity partners, we've been talking to them and crying at the loss and cheering at success in the same day. It's been really intense. And maybe that's because the last 6 months have been so reactive. The third sector is really effective at delivering a response to an immediate need. But it does come with a cost. And with World Mental Health Day just there on Saturday, I've been reflecting on how many leaders have been open about the sleepless nights and the emotional drain from the fight to keep organisations, staff, volunteers and services. Demands have been relentless, yet they spoke out when they felt overwhelmed, and I think the peer support is definitely there for them, but no amount of peer support can remove the reality that this constant solutions-based crisis response is stressful, it's unsustainable, and as we're talking about today, and then filling in another 25 application forms to try and get support adds to that additional pressure for organisations. I have full confidence that the charities know what's best for their beneficiaries, much more than us as a funder. They are at the front line, they are the experts. But what I have observed in many cases is a low weighting of time and investment in the organizations themselves. and the tools they need and where they want to be in months or even years to come as we weather the recession that's in front of us. Funders, I think, need to be more open to funding co-costs, even for the tiniest volunteer-led group, to allow them to build their own resilience, make space for innovation. And on innovation, I do believe this is part of how we move forward. We don't, as funders, have a list of solutions that we want to fund. We don't even have a full understanding of the problems faced now and coming down the line. Our day-to-day doesn't include interactions with those in need to really understand the why behind the circumstances that they are in, or what positive behaviours have emerged since lockdown, which can be maintained or built upon in the recovery. So I would encourage organisations to take a step back from the immediate solutions-focused approach, which they are so good at, but take time, spend time exploring the problem in depth, empathising with those involved, checking previous interventions are not outdated after so much has changed, and getting new, fresh evidence to bring forward. I think Einstein said if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And we really hope that charities will take this time to think deeply about the problems we are facing, as it's an easy phase to skip, yet the process where some of the most extraordinary solutions arise. And these are inspiring solutions which make the role of the fundraisers easier, and solutions that we're certainly keen to fund. So I'm kind of curious, I speak to some other funders, but I'm curious about how open the funders have been in other people's experience to giving co-funding and to trusting organizations to get on as the experts they are, but also to support innovation, which takes risks, and you can't move forward if you're not willing to take risks. As a funder, we're willing to fund that risk if it means that a greater solution will arise. But I don't know how that's feeling for charities out there.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. Great to hear that account from the other side of the table, where again there's the same impression of definite need. In that spirit, one of our audience members has just said she's a bit of a specialist in survive and thrive techniques, which sound like they could be necessary at the moment. So I've just sent her LinkedIn round because she asked me to. If anyone feels like they need help in surviving and thriving, you know where to go. I'm now going to bring in a different perspective, Philip, who's from Cancer Research UK, a very, very large charity. From where you're sat, Philip, I imagine it's a different world from the one that Peter's in, because there are dedicated people to apply for grants, and perhaps, I don't know, even sometimes do you give them out as well, or would it only be?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
So if you can do both sides of the table, that's even better. And is it a different thing with a big charity that's likely to have lots of its own systems already set up to think about moving to a sort of integrated one-stop shop form of a platform?
Yeah, for us, we're a very big charity. We're probably the biggest in the UK, I think. But in common with most of the other big charities, and what Peter was saying as well, we've seen a massive impact from COVID. In terms of what we do, first of all, on grants things, we do grant money to people. That's to scientists doing their research. That's usually done through the peer review and the academic processes, which are quite, so it's a sort of different, slightly different approach than the one we're talking about here. But in terms of our income, actually very little of it comes from grants at all. It's all raised directly through the public, through mass fundraising, and that's common with a lot of the major charities. In terms of the impact of COVID, we're going to lose about 30% of our income this year. That's £150 million that won't be going to research. We're about in the middle of the pack of the large charities. They range, the estimates, the top 10, between 20% and 60% loss of income this year. We reckon that will double over the next 2 years with the impact of a recession and ongoing COVID. We've already cut back research into cancer by 44 million this year. We think over the next 3 years, our worst case scenario is that we'll go from funding 400 million pounds of cancer research down to 250 million over the next 3 years. As with half of the cancer funding for public funded research into cancer in the UK, that has implications not just for curing cancer, but also for universities and life science as an industry within the UK. So it's significant, and you'd certainly call it a crisis. I think we saw 3 stages in terms of the impact on our funding. Initially, when COVID dominated and the NHS almost came out as the biggest charity in the UK with Captain Tom and all that, we saw a real drop in willingness to give to us. We had the British Bake Off celebrity for Stand Up to Cancer running at the time that COVID hit, and you saw the conversion rate go to 50% from audience to giving than it was last year, simply because cancer wasn't relevant. Interestingly, as the story has got out about, and you'll see more today about, 3 million people missing diagnoses because they're not turning up for to be assessed, and in clinics they've been thinking they have to stay away from hospitals. That has actually changed more recently, and people do now realise there's a crisis in cancer care and in curing cancer as well. So we are seeing more of a response now from the public, but at much lower levels than we did before. The impact on charities, I'd say, has been uneven, that 26%, depending on where their main source of fundraising is. So if, like us, you're lucky and you have a lot of people who give you regular donations through their bank account, or you have lots of people who give you money in their wills, those 2 bits of income have really stayed very, very stable. The thing that's been decimated is obviously all the shops. When they were closed, we had 600 shops doing nothing for months. Raise for Life, which raises about 35 million a year, we've been able to run none of those. We have run a virtual Raise for Life, which has managed to get us 4 million back, but it's about 10% we're seeing in terms of virtual events versus the real events. And anything which goes on in the community, which involves people going around pubs and shaking a tin or anything like that's gone. And so that is where the main impact has been on us. And obviously there's massive impact now on our operations. We in common with a lot of charities, saw a massive increase in requests about information about cancer and the impact on COVID. So demand for our services did go up over the period of COVID. But we're going to have to shrink. We are currently going through cutting about 20% of our staff at the moment. That's a process which is going on at the moment. But we are determined that we will still come back and we will still beat cancer, but it's going to be in a very different way than the way we thought it was 6 months ago.
Okay, Philip, thank you very much indeed. More slightly scary numbers there just about how bad this year has been, and that from a charity that says it's in the middle of the pack. I'm delighted to bring in now Alicia Kennedy, who I checked before, she wouldn't mind if I described her as a general Westminster Village fixer, as well as now being with Generation Rent. So I'm hoping she can say how things look from Generation Rent's point of view, but also maybe give some thoughts on like how this agenda can get some traction in Whitehall, where it's going to have to get some traction if things are going to change. In fact, I've got more questions popping in here. One from Rachel Smith saying, you're asking thousands of charities to change the way they do their paperwork. Realistically, aren't we going to need the power of government or tax breaks or something to make that happen? So, sorry, without bamboozling and disrupting your prepared remarks, I wonder if you could say something about Generation Rent, but then also on how do you get government to pay notice to this kind of thing?
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. I shall try and do that for you all. So I became director of Generation Rent in June this year, so relatively new. For those of you who don't know, Generation Rent is the national voice of the 13 million private renters, and our mission is to provide an affordable, safe and secure place for people to call their home. I think I agree with Laura that the third sector during the pandemic really stepped up. It met demand. It proved how much communities and individuals rely and need the services of charities, and still continue to need the services that charities provide. But of course, that demand for service grew at a time when the charity sector and charitable organisations were struggling themselves financially. So it's been really tough to both deal with the increased workload, step up to meet the demand because you know it's your mission to do so and you want to do so, and when you're struggling yourself financially. So a solution like Brevio, to me, where people are feeling the financial pressure, is very welcome, and I'm really encouraged and delighted to be here today. The government's £750 million package was welcome, but even in the statement himself, the Chancellor admitted that no government can make good the losses that charities have suffered, as Philip and Peter and others have outlined. The NCVO back in March estimated that charities could lose 4.3 billion of income over the 12-week lockdown. So this puts in perspective the £750 million package that has been provided. So reserves are running out for big charities and small charities and organisations like Generation alike. So solutions that bring charities and grant funders together, like Brevio, is extremely welcome. Small organisations like Generation Rent have been looking to make savings where they can. One of my first acts as director, as we were all working from home, was to release and make savings from the office contracts. So that's a change in working that obviously we're dealing with. Now, having said that, from a renter's perspective, I have staff who work from one-bedroom flats, as many people are across the country. And so while working from home is necessary because of the pandemic, it's not an ideal solution. So while I've saved money in the short term, it's not a long-term solution to any funding problems that I might have, or the pressures that I have, but savings have been made. And in a small organisation like Generation Rent, there are very few savings to make in your operational cost. Your big cost is your staff. But as Laura said, like many organisations, Generation Rent has seen its workload increase, and you need your staff to deal with the demand from the pandemic. So calls and emails to Generation Rent have increased tenfold over the period, over this quarter. And that's because thousands of renters are in severe rent debt. And just say a little about this, just a sentence or two. You can imagine a situation where renters have lost their job, their income's dried up. They may work in the hospitality or creative industry sector where they've had no income since the beginning of middle of March. They applying for benefits for the first time. The benefit they receive doesn't cover the rent that they owe, especially if they live in London and the South East. And so every month they accumulate rent debt, which means that eviction notices are more frequent as landlords to themselves, and we would recognise, probably feeling the pinch themselves. So homelessness is potentially the only option for many renters. So for Generation Rent, it's vitally important that we maintain our funding base and continue to exist to represent the private rented sector and the renters who want to call it their home. We increasingly rely on technology. It's efficient, it's cheap. It provides us with email fundraising. It provides us with the management of our case studies. It's where we put out our rights information that people can go to get rights about renting. And like Peter too, we are too small to have anyone whose job it is to concentrate on fundraising. And that's a common problem across organisations. Your resource goes into providing the staff to deliver your core mission. And that's always a priority over someone who, can help you fundraise. So fundraising largely falls to me as the director, and I'm new to grant fundraising. And I have to tell you, it's an incredibly hard landscape to navigate. There's no one place you can find information on grant funders. There's a myriad of places. You could spend hours researching that on Google. So I've talked to people in the sector. I've taken advice, tips, contacts, who funds who, put them all together. But of course, every grant funder has its own fundraising, has its own funding strategy. Of course it would. It has its own application process. It has its own deadlines. Those applications take a lot of time because they're different to each funder, which of course is, they're giving money. I don't expect them to give me money for absolutely no reason. I expect there to be a process. But anything that can relieve the amount of time that we spend on these processes would be welcome. And with an increased workload due to the pandemic and financial pressures, you know, time is one thing that organisations and small charities like Generation Rent doesn't have. And using new technology, moving to Tom's point about the political opportunity, I think the Kruger report, he's a very influential man. He's influential with the Prime Minister. He has produced a report that has some welcome recommendations in it that should be an opportunity for the sector to lobby and coalesce around and gain support for. Similarly, the Labour Party in 2019 recognised the similar problems and issues with civil society. They wanted to energise the sector, as the Kruger report does. We all, of course, have to remember that there are 9 million people who are digitally excluded. And another learning for me for the pandemic is the digitally excluded. It has brought their issues into sharp focus, because you access government support online. We're now meeting online. Your GP appointments are online. You know, you access COVID information and the guidelines online. You know, so while, you know, of course, that's the efficient way to get information out. But when you rely on the internet and social media as your main communication channel, the government needs to step up and fund organisations that can bridge that digital divide. So, you know, so from Tom, in answer to your question, I would say that with both the opposition and the Kruger report, recognising that civil society has a value, recognising that digital technology has a place in bringing together civil society and organisations who can help fund and support civil society, it is an opportunity. And I think that the key for me would be to see that the sector work together, you know, to agree the positions from that report that they want to see delivered, and work together to make sure that they are mounting the arguments and putting the evidence forward to the government. The one thing about the Kruger report is it's comprehensive. There's welcome recommendations in there, but of course it's not now clear what happens to it and how the government will respond to it. So I think that, again, you know, if there's any questions to be asked in Parliament by any politicians, is what is happening with that Kruger report, and how is the Prime Minister now going to enact the recommendations within it. But just to end finally, in summary, grant funding is complex. Rightly so. You know, these organisations are giving us money to develop a service, and they should rightly expect that our application process is on point, that our audits are on point, and that our information is together. But any technological advance that can bring together the charities and charitable organisations and like Generation Rent with the grant funders to cut out the amount of time it takes for us to research and to find out where all these organisations is a welcome initiative, and should be embraced. And I hope that I think the charities will immediately see the benefit. And I think one of the things I'd like to discuss today and hear from Billy and others is how we work together to make sure that the grant funders and the charities are invested in this system as much as possible. Because at the end of the day, you know, we all want to deliver the same objective, which is to put money into the hands of people who need it and provide services for the people that need it. You know, so I hope that working together, we can make systems like Brevio a success.
Thank you very much indeed, Alicia. And you've really brought out there a few of the nuts and bolts questions, which are also coming through on our Q&A. So, Billy, if it's all right with you, I'm going to give you a few kind of quick fire questions here. I mean, the case seems fairly, you know, powerful, but like, there is this sense that people are having to fill in different versions of the same form 10 different times, and that costs a lot of time, and that time is money in some circumstances. You know, staff time is money that could be going into something else. So all of that is clear. But there's one that's come through on the Q&A. How's this really going to work, Billy, for very small charities? Ray Cohn, I think, has put this question to us, and he's saying that, like, the amounts of money we're talking about here, even if it's a lot of time involved in getting them, are so small that it's going to be quite hard to keep track of them and keep track of all the attempts. I mean, can Brevio really go down to that granular level of detail, or is that an area where more
Yes, so I'm looking at the Q&A. I can see a couple of questions which I think relate to the point you're making, which is you're asking us to change the way the platform, if I pull up the question specifically, you're asking thousands of charities to change the way they do paperwork. Realistically, you aren't going to we will need the power of government or tax breaks to make that happen, etc. The whole point of the platform is to address the point that came up a couple of times from the previous speakers, which is today, as a charity, you need to fill in multiple applications for each funder and address a set of questions which actually we have discovered are largely speaking exactly the same questions. They may just be asked in a different order or with a slightly different flavor, or potentially you're supposed to submit them in a particular format, and that varies. But what the Brevio platform does is it creates a superset of those questions, which you basically answer, and you answer them just once. And then you submit that profile onto the Brevio platform, and funders will then be able to see essentially the answers that you have to their questions, and the platform will create those funding matches on your behalf. So what it quite specifically does is avoid the need to make multiple applications as a charity to multiple funders and all of the waste and administration that goes with that. You create your profile once. The platform will then match funding pots, if you like, to eligible charities where there is obviously a match, and notify both parties. I don't know if that answers the question, or the question that was in the Q&A.
Yeah, and there's more in the chat as well. So Dave Terrace was saying, the reality is that funders just at the moment aren't going to have enough to make up for all the cancelled fund runs and all the rest of it. And so, it's about how can we help funders stretch the money, and whether they should be less restricted. I guess spending less time on form filling is bound to help there. But then what about on the other side of things with Baroness Kennedy's point there, which is that, different charities will just need very different information. There'll be some types of charities where it's extremely important that you need to know about criminal records. If it's a charity working with children, might be quite different if you're like volunteering for a charity that's working with former offenders, or a donkey sanctuary. It could be anything, couldn't it? How do you cope with that? There's just a hugely different data that's needed by different charities.
As a charity, so as a funder or as a charity, then, as I said, there's a superset of questions and answers. But if a particular portion is not relevant to you because either that, it relates to a set of beneficiaries that you're not supporting, or as a funder, it relates to a geographic area that you don't wish to support or you're not necessarily involved in, then you either include or exclude that from your funding pot, or as a charity from your application. So all the questions that you could potentially think of are there, but you only populate the ones that are relevant to you. The same on both sides. And in addition, recognizing that in some cases funders may have quite specific needs or requirements in order to make that an initial match, then there is the opportunity for essentially free text box input as well. But obviously we've tried to keep that to a minimum, because if you make that too much part of the application, then you're just going down the same path of creating multiple versions of the same thing. So what we've really tried to do is have probably 90 or 95% of the application is once for everything, and then a very small amount of free text, which allows the grant making body, the funder, to maybe ask those couple of very specific questions that are just relevant to them.
Okay. And on the point here, I'm going to bring in Laura again, because the other half of that question was, the funders at the moment just haven't got enough money. I mean, not talking specifically about PPL, as I'll tactfully call it, but about the, many of the funders in general seeing resources drying up. the government has put in place, that some of you referred to, I think £700 million fund. Do you have any sense of how much of that you're likely to see, whether it's likely to be even remotely enough?
No, I think
None.
Yes.
None. It was targeted specifically at some small charities and at charities which were specifically concerned in the COVID effort. So it's quite a narrow thing put around that. So certainly we won't see any of it.
I see. So it's really, it's not just about the dried up income, it's about the fact that you needed extra resources to help with the COVID thing. Gosh, so it's quite big, quite big.
I think there's also that additional challenge of, you know, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't seem super urgent right now, but if we don't fund it, years of work will be reversed.
Yeah.
So there's so much good data and evidence going into future advocacy and policy work, and there's data gaps that are starting to arise now, whether that's about species behavior or pollution in the air. There's a lot in that area as well, which people couldn't go out and do because they were self-isolating. A lot of volunteers are over 65 and in a group that wasn't, you know, going out at all during the lockdown. And I'm sure that was seen very much with the food bank support. So I think that there is, you know, there are multiple other areas of funding that need to be released and have access for, and maybe the Brevio system can help to categorize that in terms of how a funder goes into that system and looks for stuff that's about immediate need versus keeping stuff going that's going to, you know, change forever if we don't, you know, address the impact of reversing the progress.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we've got something here from Prapi, who's saying, did the government 700, oh no, it's about the same question. I think I've more or less dealt with that. And then we've got another one come in. Sorry, it's very confusing to go between the two messages. Ray Cohn, I'm afraid Billy is back saying that's not quite the question I meant. How funders changed their own processes so they can follow the myriad of outputs from the large number of community-based charities. With COVID, the temptation is to dump smaller applications as requiring too much QA and supply chain expertise. It's the funders that need the help, he's saying, and not the charities. Now, I do, you can pick up on that specifically. There's a more general point here, which is, I imagine there's some politics on there at a certain point of trying to deal with both sides of the table at once, both of which will have different pressures. How do you smooth that over?
Sorry, Tom, was that question for me, or did you?
Yes, yeah. How you were speaking to two audiences, and there's different, who both have very different pressures on the funders and the charities, and how you smooth that over and how you deal with that.
I don't know if I'll see if I can answer the question correctly. We've had a number of funders come onto the platform, and initially they're actually using Brevio as more of a research tool than a funding tool. So what they're doing is they're going in and saying, through the platform, can I identify where there are specific areas of need that I think I could fund or match with the funding that I have? So is there a particular group of beneficiaries, or is there a particular sector, or is there a particular geographic area that I feel that as a grant maker I could be more proactively supporting? And by going into the platform, they can essentially search where are charities seeking funding and for what, and they can get a very sort of numeric view of that, which, you know, could well be useful in setting their own sort of goals and objectives. And I think the other angle that we haven't particularly discussed is really relates, I suppose, to data and transparency. So Brevio is a data-led decision-making platform. So in addition to combating the waste and inefficiency that we've talked about, Brevio also aims to reduce some of the bias and barriers to entry that fundraising organisations so that charity has. And I think the pandemic's really highlighted, actually, one thing that we haven't really talked about, but I'm sure Peter would talk about at length and with much more knowledge than me, but there is an imbalance, or there's a bias and imbalance in the distribution of charities across the UK. Many of those charities are concentrated in larger cities, and and alongside really some of the larger funders. And at times that can mean that charities that are doing crucial work in other areas sort of risk missing out on funding. And what Brevio does, because it's essentially a data-driven marketplace, it helps align funders with charities who most suit their needs. And in often cases, it could be exposing charities to funders that the funders were not aware of before. So in many ways, the analogy I used earlier about the sort of digital dating apps and the fact that those apps and services have actually increased people's opportunity to meet outside of their normal social sort of sphere of work or family or education, university. The same thing applies, really looking at the third sector, and how can a grant maker really know which charities they would like to support if they haven't found a way to sort of engage with them, particularly given the fact that there are sort of 9,000-10,000 grant makers or funders, but many hundreds of thousands of charities operating across the UK, and not just charities, but obviously other associations that are delivering a social good. So I've sort of broken it out into two areas. I don't know if that helps to address the question or not.
Extremely helpful. I wonder now if we should just have, because Alicia's been very good for us on how you get the era of ministers and bringing Danny Kruger in and his report recently and all of that. But because everyone in some sense is in the same boat, the whole sector's feeling this difficulty, rising needs, falling incomes. I wonder if Peter, Philip and Laura, each of you might have one suggestion for the others, whether it's a small charity thought for a big charity thought, or a funder's thought for either charity or vice versa, where the people you deal with on the other side of things, how you would appeal to them to change their behaviour so that people can work as smoothly as possible together through this shared emergency. Anyone want to go first? Peter, we haven't heard from you for a bit. Anything you particularly like to beg, say, the funders for or the larger charities?
Yeah, actually, can I be greedy and have two asks, please? So I think the first one I would ask is around generous leadership. And so what's been apparent through the COVID period is that organisations, particularly large organisations, statutory organisations, have kind of left their egos at the door and not brought them into a lot of the meetings that we've been having. And it's the focus has been on how can we kind of get through and meet the massive needs that are appearing in our community. So I think that larger organisations. To be fair, Philip's probably shaking his head on this one because I appreciate the level of cuts that you're sort of going through, and a number of organisations are in that position. But there are, by definition, larger organisations would tend to be more robust and more resource able to kind of help the smaller organisations. So I think if you think about it, the survey Newham said that one in four charities is in danger of going under if they don't get support and help, and that is massive. And I think when you add into the equation that deprived areas actually have fewer charities set up in them, the New Philanthropy Capital did some research on this in January, showing that deprived areas have fewer charities, and where those charities exist, they're less robust, they last less long than in more affluent areas. So if you look at an area like Newham, I think there's a massive challenge about, how do we actually get, smaller organisations to kind of be more sort of resilient. My second ask would be to funders, and for me, there's a power dynamic. It's similar to the leave the egos at the door concept that I think a lot of organisations did well or have done well through COVID. But there has, as far as I've been in trust and foundation fundraising, there is a power dynamic. There is almost a sense with a number of funders, and Laura, this is not necessarily aimed at you because I know that you're a very good funder, but there's a number of funders that kind of expect to see, charities kind of jump to and dance to their tune, and that becomes part of, rightly or wrongly, intentionally or unintentionally, there is that power dynamic. And so I think that, again, it comes back to ego and actually, what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to achieve together? And so I think the beauty of something like Brevia, and I think there are, I've got questions around sort of the nuances and the detail and how an organisation like ours can accentuate a particular, we put in a grant bid and we'll tweak it depending on who we're asking for the money. Do you know what I mean? So I think there are things to be ironed out, but I think the principle of we're in this together, let's work together to find solutions is really important.
Okay, and let's hear from you now, Laura. Anything you particularly beg the people who are asking for funding to bear in mind? Time's running a bit short.
I think, I think I go back to the point I made at the start around co-funding. I think that it's, and there shouldn't, I don't think that we as funders are the experts, and I think we have to trust the organisations who are on the front line to do the work they need to do without jumping through the hoops. And even some of the funders have said, oh, you can change your use of funds now during the pandemic, but give me a list of outcomes for that new change. And then as you reforecast 2 months later, then you have to change again. And so there's flexibility with conditions. And I think that unrestricted funding is really important. And I would like to ask charities to think about that kind of core strengthening of their organisation. Because some of the organisations that have weathered the recent times better are the ones that have perhaps put the less urgent problems first or further up the to-do list. The ones that have a greater age diversity of their volunteers have had a different experience. The ones that have invested in their digital strategy with, I think we've got the charity digital skills report said 27% of charities cancelled their services because their organisations or their users didn't have the necessary skills or technology. So, invest in the digital. I think about half of them are saying that funders won't fund digital. If you fund core, you fund digital. And I would say, 2/3 of charity boards aren't able to use digital. So how are they meeting during the pandemic? There's a lot of core stuff that's not particularly attractive that needs to be supported. So I would ask charities to push funders to do core costs.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Laura. And Philip, finally, because time is up now, but any one appeal you'd like to make to?
Well, I'd echo what Peter was saying about collaboration across the sector. I think we're now in an environment with a government that doesn't really understand the impact of the charitable sector as well as it might. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do working together. We're working on 2 initiatives at the moment, one about trying to increase the amount of rebate that's available through gift aid, which would help all charities, large and small. We're working with large and small charities on the Life Sciences Charity Partnership Fund to explain the role that plays in advancing not just battle against cancer, but lots of other diseases and the impact it has with the government. And I think the more we stand up for the sector as a whole and work together, the better we'll be. And Alicia was talking about, what needs to be done with the Krug report, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to me an area where we can really collaborate and all benefit from.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to see if either Alicia Kennedy or Billy Wright wants a final word, and then I'm going to wrap up because we are at time.
I'd like to jump in with a couple of points, if that's okay, quickly. But Alicia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, shall I go first, Billy? Because obviously you can summarise the event. I just suppose from my point of view, because I'm obviously here as Generation Rent, just a recognition from funders and other charities that Generation Rent actually isn't a charity, but it's a limited company, with charitable aims, and therefore we do miss out on a lot of funders or gift aid, as Philip just mentioned, and so I'd like to not take anything away from the charity sector, because obviously they're in desperate need of it, but see there's a place for other organisations that are delivering a charitable benefit and that we do fit in, and many grant funders are recognising that, and that's greatly appreciated. And if we were going to collaborate, Philip and Peter and Laura, which I think is exactly the right thing to do, especially when you're arguing for government or legislation, or the strength of your argument and your togetherness is what gives you the power. And I'd want to be part of that. But obviously, I'd like to see the sector expanded to include all types of organisations that deliver a charitable benefit.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And so everyone really in different ways saying, be mindful of our needs, and we'll try and be mindful of yours in this kind of mixed ecology that is the third sector. Billy, then, a last word from you.
Very specifically on Peter's point, yes, you can tweak the way you make applications and make them very specific and granular, so you can have multiple requests. On Laura's point, actually one of the default applications within Brevio is for core funding. And then the final point, which is really keying off what Alicia has said, so the problem that Brevio is here to solve has been openly discussed by the sector since the 1980s, but it hasn't really been addressed at any scale or in any meaningful way in the intervening 50 years. So the reason Brevio set up as a limited company was purely to try and address that problem at speed and with a degree of agility. If we'd set it up as a charity, we'd still be talking about it now. What we've actually done is we've launched the platform. It's there, it's live, it's running, and that's in 24 months. We don't need to stay as a limited company. We're very happy to look at transitioning into being a charity. We're very happy to look at setting up a JV with organisations that are operating within the sector. We're very open to looking at it as a partnership. So I think it's very important that people recognise we're not set up as a limited company to profiteer from the third sector. We set up as a limited company to solve the problem quickly. Now we want to figure out how we can actually make that platform available to the sector to solve what I think we all need to look at together.
Thank you very much, and that does tie up quite nicely all of the various comments. We've still got good questions, some of them specific about Brevio, how it works, if charities have to pay, what they have to pay, and the real details.
Free at the moment and will be for at least the next sort of year or so, but obviously at some point it needs some degree of funding just to support operational costs. But that's where maybe looking at a joint venture with others in the sector or transitioning to becoming a charity could be a solution.
Thank you very much for that. And we'll have a quick look afterwards, and if there are more specific questions, perhaps, Billy, we could fire those across to you if they're specific. For everyone watching, thanks for being here and firing in all those questions. We've done our best to get through as many as we could. Some of it's quite detailed stuff, so if it repays rewatching, re-listening, I think there'll be a recording that you'll be able to access in due course, and I'm sure others in the sector will want to look at that as well. So I'd just like to close by saying thank you very much to our panellists, to Alicia Kennedy, to Laura Chow, to Philip Almond, to Peter Laing, all of whom have shown both some of the urgency of this moment for their own sectors, their own problems, and also an impressive degree of understanding given the emergency of the challenges of the other people in the sector as well. Thanks also to Billy for giving such a detailed explanation of how Brevio works, how he thinks it will make a difference, and indeed thanks to Brevio for getting behind the discussion. And thanks to all of you for being such a lively and engaged audience there. But we will leave that now there for now. So thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.